We praise and thank Allah for being here and to observe Black History Month in February, a cold month of February, and to understand the Muslim perspective. I have been studying this issue for the last 15 years, and I have traveled extensively in the Caribbean and Latin America and in North America to research and to present on this issue. Last year I was in Halifax, and I was fortunate enough to meet a close colleague, Dr. Afua Cooper, who now has the chair of the Black History Studies in Halifax, in Dalhousie University. And she was saying to me that they are now found 49 settlements, black settlements in Halifax. As we know the story, that Harriet Tubman, she came from America to Canada under the pretense of the Underground Railroad. And many of these slaves were Muslims. And she was fortunate to bring 300 slaves and 19 trips from America to Canada. And many of them have settled in Niagara, they have settled in Muskoka, they have settled in Halifax and many other places in Canada. And we have a rich history. However, not much is known in terms of the Muslim roots of these slaves. The Quran reminds us that we have a history, and sometimes that history revolves among nations, where some nations are remembered and some are forgotten because of the rise and decline of civilization. And one such history is that of the Moors that came from Spain. Today I will try to show you slides, and I will give you facts and histories about the slaves that came from West Africa after the fall of Ferdinand and Isabella's Spain, that was ruled by the Moors for almost 800 years. Ferdinand and Isabella made it a point, after getting rid of the Moors, that they will take on the new world, which is really Americas and the Caribbean and Latin America. And they will find ways of conquering what we call the First Nations, or the Amerindians, the people who lived here before us. And in so doing, they brought slaves to work on the plantations, the sugar plantations and the cotton fields of this part of the world. In bringing those slaves, it was believed that almost from 40% to 70% were Muslims. And the reason being, and we'll go to the first slide, is that those slaves came from predominant Muslim countries and Muslim states. What is popularly regarded as the next slide, popularly regarded as the Sanghe Ali Caliphate of Mali. Now, if you remember in school, many people say to you, when you do not perform very well, go to Timbuktu, as if Timbuktu is a place for dummies. But Timbuktu has been the city that had the famous Sankore University, and Mbeki, the South African Prime Minister, recently, he has ordered academics out of South Africa to microfilm those manuscripts, some 1,600 manuscripts that were written in Arabic as well as Latin by Muslim scholars in the 16th century and kept there in the archives of Timbuktu. So Muslims coming from this caliphate of Mali, of Timbuktu, of Gambia and Senegal and Nigeria and Ivory Coast. Like the blacks that came to Guyana came from Ivory Coast, and those that came to Jamaica, the Yorubas, they came from Nigeria, and those that came to this part of the Americas, they came from Liberia. That's why the Free Tongue of Liberia was established when slaves went back to Liberia after buying their freedom from the slave masters. So we could safely say millions and millions of Muslims came to this part of the world, but they were forced to become Christians. They were forced to lose their Islamic identity, and they were forced even to give up, some of them who were animists and worship their ancestors in what we call libation, as a form of ancestral remembrance among the animist religion. They also were forced to give up their practices and now to adopt the belief in Jesus Christ. Many of those slaves, they jumped overboard, refusing to change their religions, and they said, we rather to become suicidal and to die as dogs than to live in the slave camps and to lose our religion. Many others were not that brave, and they came to this part of the world, as you can see from the slide. They traveled in ships in very atrocious conditions for months at times, packed like sardines in these ships without much fresh water and food, and beaten. And they were forced to eat things like pork As Muslims, we do not eat pork, or at least the Islamic tradition in the Quran reminds us, Hurima alaykum lahm al-khinzir, that pork is something that's forbidden for Muslims. But these Muslims were forced to have pork in the form of a cuisine called sweet and sour pork. Sweet and sour pork is made from the pigtail. It was introduced as a dish to these slaves to slowly and gradually acclimatize them to eating something that was not part of the tradition. Next. Now, this is a mosque in Mali, in Timbuktu. It's a very famous mosque, and as you know, Muslims are famous for building mosques. It's a highlight of the Muslim architecture wherever you travel. If you travel in India, for example, you will notice that the mosques that were built 700 years ago, the walls are very thick. And there's a reason for that. They don't have the heating system we have in Canada. So in winter, it remains warm, and in summer, it remains cool. This is the same concept here in this mosque. It's mud, and it's very thick. And it's a famous mosque that still exists until today in Senegal. Next. Similar pictures of mosque. So if we understand that the slaves came from this part of the world, of West Africa, we understand that their rich history, we understand that they had to be Muslims, and they came to this part of the world as Muslims. As a matter of fact, some of the slaves built a mosque when they came in the Garifunas, as they know in Belize. Until today, if you travel to Belize, in certain parts, you will find that they built a mosque. And in Dominica, in the Caribbean, they built mosque. In Brazil, they built a Kaaba because they couldn't go for the Hajj. They couldn't go for the pilgrimage to Mecca, so they built something that resembled the Kaaba so that they can go around that structure. So they built mosques when they came because this is what they were accustomed to doing. Yes. Different types of mosques that they built in West Africa. And as you can see, they had their own form of technology. As a matter of fact, Dr. Van Sert, he is a Guyanese anthropologist out of Oxford University. I've met him more than once in black conferences. And he wrote the book, They Came Before Columbus. He's referring to the Spain who came from West Africa and who were introduced by Tariq bin Ziyad that came from Morocco and brought Islam to Spain. And until today, when you travel to Spain, you see so many museums that were formerly mosques, as well as the famous Court of the Red Lions and Alhambra, etc. So Muslim architecture is known, and they brought that to this part of the world. So for example, the windows that we have in North America called the California windows, they trace their origins to the Moors of Spain and to that of Morocco. Arabic, very important. The slaves spoke different languages, and we know part of the divide and rule policy of the colonialists was to ensure that slaves from the same tribes were not landed in the same plantations. In South Carolina, in Canada, it had 3,000 slaves approximately. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, it had almost 1 million slaves. And I've seen this in Panama. There were blacks living in Panama. Wherever I've traveled in the world, in this Western Hemisphere, I've seen that the tribes, they were mixed, and they were not allowed to land as a tribe together in the same plantation, so they couldn't communicate. What is it that kept them to communicate? It was Arabic language. These slaves, they knew Arabic, and a testimony to that, there was a certain document that was found circulating among the slaves from Brazil all the way to Jamaica, among what is known as the Yoruba fighters. They fought against the Redcoats and won that war against the Redcoats. They were circulating a document called the Wasika, and the Wasika is traced back to Nigeria by Usman Dan Fodio. Usman Dan Fodio, in the 1800s, he fought against the British colonialists, and he circulated this Wasika asking for the slaves at that time to riot against the slave masters and teaching them Islamic principles. And this document is found until today, and this is a known fact. As a matter of fact, in Guyana, there is a document that was written by the Imam Kafi, who fought against the Dutch in 1763, and that document is held in the archives until today, and it's written Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the beginning of the document. So they communicated in Arabic. When the Indian Muslims came from India, subsequent to the ending of slavery in 1838 in the West Indies, the Indians who spoke Arabic, being Muslims, they also communicated in Arabic to the black slaves. So Arabic was a known language. This is a photograph of Abdurrahman, right? Not our Abdurrahman here. He's much more handsome. But this photograph is a handsome photograph because he's a prince. Abdurrahman Dominic, he lived in Grenada and later on came to Canada. And if you notice in Arabic, on his photograph, it's in Arabic, it's written in Arabic, so anyone who knows Arabic will see that even if you have a spattering of Arabic language, Ismuhu Abdurrahman, his name is Abdurrahman, as easily translated. He was a prince. Abdurrahman was a prince actually that came from West Africa, and there was a movie that was made, a documentary about Abdurrahman. It's called Among the Prince, a PBS documentary to trace his heritage. In America, there is even an effigy of some of the slaves, including Kunti Kanti. And Kunti Kanti, in the book Roots by Alex Haley, he traced his roots back to Liberia, where he actually traveled to Freetown, Liberia, and met his family. So this is something, of course, sometimes when you're told to go back to where you belong, you can't always find the address, not even on a Google Earth. You can find exactly where your ancestors came in West Africa. But some people have been fortunate to do that. Kunti Kanti, his story continues that his hand and feet were cut off. Why? Because he was found praying salat in the barn of his slave master in the States. And the slave master wanted him not to pray. If he was not a Muslim, he would have prayed anyway without his hand and feet. That is, he could have prayed in his mind, he could have prayed with, in every fashion you can pray in other faith traditions. But in Islamic tradition, you have to stand, and you have to bow, and you have to raise your hands, and you have to go on the ground and prostrate. So your hands and feet are important in making prayers. And that's why he lost some parts of his limbs because of his prayers. If you know, there was a book that was done by a Canadian writer. There's a successful book called Book of Negroes by Lawrence Hill. And Lawrence Hill, when he talks in his fictional or semi-fictional story of a girl that traces her roots back to Nova Scotia, I think, she talks about her grandparents being Muslims, and the name Amina or Aminatu. We know the Prophet Muhammad's mother was Amina. So there is a lot of literature that we can go back to. Dr. Afua Cooper's, she has done immense research upon a girl in Montreal that lit a fire in Montreal, and more than Angelique is her name, but more than one of her characters, Dr. Afua has referred to many times in her research as a black history specialist of being Muslim. And Dr. Hakeem Quick, Abdullah Hakeem Quick, has written his book, Deeper Roots. He gives us a lot of info in terms of documents that were circulated among the black slaves, including showing their names, like Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was a famous name among Muslims, and Umar and Muhammad. And if you travel to Cuba, for example, you find Umar is a famous name because black slaves came to Cuba. And the word Cuba is really Quba. In Arabic, the first mosque was Quba, Masjid Quba. So this is Kunti Kanti's. If you notice, he has the head tie. The Muslims are accustomed in certain parts to wear the turban or the head tie. And I will show you later on how Harriet Tubman, she even wore the hijab. Let's go. In Brazil until today, there was a festival for the slaves. The Negroes are almost 1 million in Brazil, or the Africans, rightly we could say. And they have a festival. And if you look at that festival, they have the sword fight. And they have the white robes with their white turbans that they wear every year. And the women will wear long clothing like hijab. When I was in certain parts of Latin America, I saw women who wearing the long clothing like the hijab. They did not cover their hair, but they wear the long gowns, which is something that is familiar in the Muslim world, that even non-Muslims in the Muslim world, they wear the long gowns. Hajj. I said this earlier. Now, the people had made the Hajj before, because Hajj has been going on for years, and they only came in the 1830s to this part of the world. So many of them had made the Hajj, or they heard about the Hajj, and they came from a country that was of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is another figure that we celebrate in Black History Month. You can find his book or books about him in the library.